Yearly Meeting Clark, from the Epistle of London Yearly Meeting, 1915. Most of our fellow Christians, some even of our own members, are actively supporting a war that they detest as much as we do. We honor this self-sacrifice, the courage and devotion of those who seek to forward or defend the kingdom of righteousness by means of war. But we claim with absolute conviction, though with great humility, that only spiritual power can defend or advance the spiritual causes which matter to the world. We claim that there is a better way and that love alone can avail to find and follow it. It has been an encouragement to us at this meeting to know that the bulk of our young men are prepared to refuse military service of any kind. It is our prayer that we may all be strong to endure if a day of trial should come, in all humility, taking our stand with those who, by suffering, have served mankind.
I'm Nicholas Evans, and I belong to Harrogate Quaker Meeting in the York area. I want to talk about my great-uncle, a man I never met, a man called Thomas Edward Tawell, which is spelt Tawell, and he lived between 1881 and, if I've got it right, well, the book he did was between 1881 and 1920. He died, I think, about 1956. I think he was a reasonable man and understood the problems that nations have, but he was certainly not in favour of killing people. He was very dismayed by it. He'd seen it coming, in a way, and if I may just quote from himself, in the little book that he wrote some years after the war, he says, at one point, the war was coming to the country, mobilisation was happening, all kinds of problems were emerging. Ted said, meanwhile, I had my own soul-searching to do. As a Quaker, I had a twofold obligation, to God and to my fellow men. This, of course, was nothing new. It was just plain old-fashioned Christianity. So that's his stance. He was not called up immediately, but at the beginning of the war, in the middle of 1914, he and a number of other people were very concerned about what, as Quakers or as pacifists, they could do. And he was one of the young men who formed all kinds of groups and eventually culminated in the formation of the Friends Ambulance Unit, First World War version. He didn't get in immediately. He was part of the group, as I say, that set it up, but he was not deployed for a while, and I think he found that rather frustrating. I think it was 1916, in July, he says, I got to the end of my patience in waiting to know my fate because he wanted to know whether he would be registered as a conscientious objector. He went to the nearest tribunal in Holborn, he says, to make a frank statement of my case and ask what they desired me to do. And they dug up his file and they said, what would you like to do? And he said, anything but killing human beings, I replied, aware that this was a sort of challenge to the chair of the tribunal who had lost his only son in battle and was likely to be somewhat bitterly sceptical of conscientious objectors. But anyway, the interview proceeded. It was very amicably dealt with. He was told that he could go back and rejoin his unit, and he shook hands with the chairman of the tribunal, and they parted on good terms. That, to me, is a bit like what Ted was like. When he did eventually get in, there was urgent medical work needed to deal with people's injuries, and this was at Dunkirk in northern France, and later on in a village a little way from Dunkirk. And then, of course, people got moved around, and you didn't always know where they were. So a lot of it was very basic hospital work.
Lawrence Cadbury, Headquarters, Friends Ambulance Unit, British Expeditionary Force, 26th of May, 1916. Dear Father and Mother, since I last wrote, we've been having a terrible time, the air being thick with ultimatums and memorandums. No sooner has one affair been about settled and thoughts of leave become possible, than something else has turned up, and we've been in the thick of it again. The only thing to be said for being thus constantly kept on the bustle is that it keeps one from becoming too desperately depressed at the idea of 2 or 3 more years utterly wasted in this infernal war, and one's heart from being made too unutterably sick to perform its normal functions, by a morbid hope of an offensive being deferred year after year. Work is the only thing to keep one from being haunted by the vision of an endless vista of dreary winters of preparation, springs of postponement, summers of apathy, and autumns of resignation to the prospect of another cycle about to commence. One consolation is that every day is a day nearer the end of the war, and no power on earth can shake that comforting thought. I think I shall get out some large sheets of paper, half a dozen or so, with 365 days on each, and start crossing the days off, one by one. The first commotion was about consciences. I don't object to consciences, not even over-manured ones, so long as they only prompt people to self-regarding actions. But when they start seriously and adversely affecting other people, I consider it time to remind their owners that there are other considerations besides their own particular and peculiar individualities to be borne in mind. That there are other people in the world, and that their welfare should at least be given a thought, if only a passing one. Anyway, our conscientious purists completely forgot everything else, and when they heard that people were being sent to prison, dashed round the country getting people to sign a memorandum, telling the government that all people who claimed conscientious exemption were sincere in the first place, and holding the awful threat over their heads that if they did not reform their wicked ways, then, in the name of the Friends Ambulance Unit, they would return home. The scandalous parts of the proceedings were that our CO, Maxwell, was away all the time, and that the whole thing was engineered by a little group at HQ, quite regardless of the wishes of or the interests of the vast majority of the unit. Consequently, there had been a row with the authorities over unauthorized and what they regard as highly objectionable people visiting the ambulance trains. And, more serious still, we learnt that the whole thing had been brought to the notice of General Headquarters, and that, as a result, they were very doubtful whether our continued presence was desirable.
Ted Tawell had been trained as a pharmacist, and he was able to bring that knowledge and skill and expertise to the management of infection in hospitals. And there was, of course, an awful lot of that, not just people with injuries, but at one stage he talks about there being typhoid brought in by civilians, and the problems they had dealing with that are described in the book. I think they separated a lot of the typhoid carriers from the people with injuries and were eventually effective in controlling the spread of infection. But that was, of course, given the knowledge of 100 years ago. They got used to listening to bombs, and there was suddenly this new awful kind of noise and bomb. And it was a Big Bertha, and the Germans were experimenting with the Big Bertha bomb or whatever it was, rocket, and near them. His whole attitude to other people was of wanting to understand them and to appreciate them and to be their friend. And so I think his attitude to the unconditional objection to war service would have been respected by him.
Egbert Cadbury, Royal Naval Air Station, Great Yarmouth, 2nd August, 1915. Dear Lawrence, I wrote and asked you your advice about joining up to this show. I'm still awaiting your reply. That was 2 months ago. I asked our old Admiral about taking a commission in this show. He advised me to, so I went into the Admiralty and got signed on. I went on to Chingford, where I learnt to fly. Having got on rather fast, I was appointed to this station, which is said to be the best home station going. Oh my God, I've just heard I've got to do my first patrol tonight. Since starting this, I've had quite an eventful time. I went out for patrol and went over Sheringham at a height of 3,500 feet. An inlet valve broke, and also the induction pipe fractured. The engine fired back into the carburetor and set it alight with a hell of an explosion. I thought the whole machine had been caught. However, by turning the petrol off, and by the frantic and timely efforts of my mechanic, the fire was outed. The casualty lists have been awful lately. Pretty well the whole of last year's Lent boat have been wiped out, either being killed or badly wounded. Where the devil is this damn show going? Well, cheerio, old fella. For God's sake, don't get a Jack J in your alimentary canal, as, having beaten you at tennis last year, and the year previous, I should like to do so again in 1916.
He was a very tolerant man, and I'm sure that he regarded them with loving kindness. He came from a very large family. There were 7 sons, and of those 6 were capable of military service, and 1 did actually serve in the Australian Imperial Force, and he was amongst those who tragically lost their lives to friendly fire, so called, at Gallipoli. Another brother was not in the army but was doing work of national importance for farmers, and 2 others were well away from everything in Australia, and they didn't seem to get implicated in the war at all. Resentment would be much too strong a word for my great-uncle. He was a good deal older than some of the other young men, and he found himself in charge at the base and in England for quite a while, but he wasn't sent abroad for quite a while and chafed at this. Anyway, he did eventually get abroad, but he was much older, and he obviously had man management skills, and these were recognised, and they kept him tied to the base where he would see that everything was organised properly and worked well. I'm not sure if it was Jordan's, but he did do a training camp with FAU right at the beginning. I think they went away for 4 or 6 weeks, and they did mountain trip. I mean, it's a bit like an outward bound thing, only more serious. And they learned how to get up early and eat an early breakfast, which they had to cook themselves, and how to be self-sufficient. And I'm sure that early training, as with a number of later Friends Ambulance Unit groups, or cadres, or whatever you call them, was a very important part of the skill development for people who perhaps hadn't been used ever to cooking for themselves, or dealing with nasty injuries, and also useful in terms of group cohesion and bonding, as we would call it now. The story that I'm working from was one he wrote in about 1950, after he'd spent 30 years or so in the United States. And his book, which is a lovely story and is available in Friend's House, goes up to his departure to America in about 1920-21. He was a member of the Friends meeting in Ohio. He worked for a while at, Woods Hole Oceanological Research Unit in Massachusetts, and then settled in Ohio, where he and married and had a boy.
Egbert Cadbury, Royal Naval Air Station, Great Yarmouth, 20th November, 1915. Dear Lawrence, I heartily agree with you in regard to this bloody murder that's going on. Nearly all the men I know have been done in, and I wish to God that those long-caned, nimble-footed idiots who arranged for and saw that we got war could be made to fight it out. My great desire is to get away from anything mechanical, go on a long shooting trip somewhere, or buy a farm miles away from anywhere with good shooting, fishing, and 1 or 2 bloody fine horses. There is one thing I'm quite certain about, and that is I never want to fly again. Of all the goddamn pursuits, flying takes the bun. The novelty and excitement have long since gone, and now one only thinks what a bee if one's to break one's blasted neck. I think I did the right thing in joining this show, but I should never advise you to do so, for you would get so thoroughly sick of the awful idiots in the air service. Of course, there are a few devilish good fellows, but those who are joining up now are bloody awful. To join the air service now would be absolutely disastrous, so for God's sake don't dream of doing so, for I'm absolutely positive that you would regret it. Thank God that it's blowing like hell and there's a bloody fine moon. Combination ought to give these Zeppelins cold feet.
From what I've read about Ted and the few things I've heard about him, he was a man to absorb and use experience rather than to reject or deny it. My great-uncle's influence is very recent, but his family, both my parents' families, were of the Quaker persuasion, and therefore I grew up thinking about pacifism, and conscientious objection came reasonably naturally, though I had to have quite a few discussions with people before I kind of got clear about it. And as a teenager of somewhat immature development, I really, looking back at it, I don't think I knew what I was about, really. I hadn't got firm, clear views, but I did eventually seek to register as a CO. So I then went to the Bristol Tribunal, and my case was regarded as a clear case for Alternative C. I heard them muttering this to each other, and I didn't know what that was, but it turned out to be alternative service in something like the Friends Ambulance Unit International Service, as it by then was, 1956, I think I had the tribunal. So I was allowed to join that. The irony was that I applied to the FAU and they turned me down. And the reason was very interesting, because I wrote and said, why not? Why can't I join? And they said, the secretary said, well, I don't think you've really thought through the unconditionalist position. And of course, that was absolutely true. I hadn't begun to think about it. I was such a kid. But he sent me a long letter about it and then finished off by saying, well, anyway, if you're prepared to adopt Quaker views on peace and war and go anywhere and do anything, which were the two current slogans of the FAU at the time, then come along, bring your rucksack of stuff and join me here at Melksham or wherever it was, and you can be a member. And of course, being in the FAU, that 2 years changed my life. I grew up and I developed into something a lot more mature than I had ever been before. And I saw a lot of things in hospitals, for example, and in refugee camps that I would not have seen, I think, if I'd just gone along and been confined to barracks in places in England. It was a wonderful, life-changing experience for me. It led me to go to university, which was something I'd never even thought about before. And whether it gave me the career in psychology that I subsequently followed, I don't know, but it made me think. And so I thought through more about what I was doing.
Nancy Tennant, Memories of the First World War. A YMCA started in Stansted, our local town, and I went just to hand out cups of tea there. And then, when the unit was moving, a woman who was running it asked if I would go with her, as she was setting up a YMCA on Salisbury Plain. And off I went. It was a camp for New Zealand soldiers, and it was wildly uncomfortable and cold. Well, it wasn't really very practical, as most of the people running it were about 17, like I was, and we tended to get ill. However, I enjoyed it. I remember the sense of doom at the outbreak of war. We didn't realise what we were in for. We really did see it as a crusade, and it was going to be the final war. My brother said, "We are fighting for Christ against the forces of evil." My family were only there for such a short time. They nearly all got killed within about 6 weeks. My brother came tearing back from Canada, where he was working, thinking that he was going to be too late. And he was killed in May 1915. He had, perhaps 2 or 3 months, certainly not more. There was this terrible week. I had 2 cousins and a brother all killed in this 1 week. I had the sisters of those cousins with me, and my parents were away. I got the news that I had to tell one of them that her brother was missing. Well, we knew that they wouldn't turn up. And then I got the news about my brother. I was alone when it happened. And my older brother mercifully was saved by having TB, and although he was in intelligence, he never had to go to war. God moves in a mysterious way. But before that, my brother-in-law was killed in November 1914. He was a regular soldier. They were in India, and my sister came back. She was pregnant, and he went to Mesopotamia. But there was no point in going to Mesopotamia at all. Nobody knew what to do when they got there or why they were there. They were just killed. And that's the horror of the First World War, the utter confusion. My brother-in-law was killed a week before his baby was born. We were always a very loving, united family, and I don't think my mother ever recovered, really. She was ill for a long time afterwards, and I remember at some stage, perhaps 1915, 16, having a sort of deadly sense of peace coming over me, because I didn't think I had anyone left, anyone I knew, to be killed. And so that shaped the rest of our lives. My whole generation, I think, was never young. We didn't have any sort of youth.
I'm Marjorie Gordy, and I belong to Osmotherley Quaker meeting and Great Ayton Quaker meeting. I'm going to be talking about Norman Gordy, who was my father-in-law, and he came from East Bolden, near Sunderland. Norman was a conscientious objector in the First World War, but he wasn't a Quaker. He'd come in contact with Quakers, but he himself was a Congregationalist. Sadly, I never met him. He died in 1955 due to asthma because of the conditions that he suffered while he was a conscientious objector. He was only 19. Well, he believed that it was quite wrong to kill. He was a member of the Congregational Church, but of course until he was actually asked to join the army in 1916, I didn't meet him, I didn't know him, so I really don't know how it affected him in any way. He was a clerk working for the railway, and he'd heard that he was going to be picked up from his work and taken to Richmond. So he got onto the train, he jumped the train early and went and told his mother that what was happening, and then he jumped back on the train again and went to be arrested. He was quite against the war, and he thought it was absolutely wrong that there should be a war, and he felt there were other ways to deal with the situation. He was taken then to Richmond Castle in North Yorkshire, and there were 16 others there, and they were held there. They tried to put army uniform on him, and it took 8 soldiers to try and get the uniform on because he was a very fit man. He was a great footballer. He was in the Sunderland second team, and he also played for Darlington. So Bert Brocklesby, who was also there, said to him, well, really, if you're a conscientious objector, that's no way to behave, because he thought that that was actually fighting, because he was fighting against the soldiers and it wasn't being a pacifist at all. So he did eventually put his army uniform on. He believed that everybody should follow their own conscience, and he went that way because that's how he felt and that he couldn't kill, but he respected their opinion. His mother was very anxious because he wasn't allowed, when he was in prison, to send letters home because he refused to do anything in the prison. His mother became quite ill, and he discovered that his mother was ill, and so he did decide in the end to sew mailbags so that his mother could get letters from him and hear from him. He had a sister who was very helpful to him and supported him. His other brothers, he was one again of 7. He was the youngest, and his father had died when he was 2 years old, so his mother was a widow, and the other brothers were supporting the family, really. But there's no mention of how they felt about him.
Andrew Fawkes, 4th of August, 1914, Pembroke College, Cambridge. My dear Pa, I have taken it upon myself to volunteer at once for the Royal Army Medical Corps. Whether I shall be more useful in the ranks as a stretcher-bearer or hospital orderly than as an officer in the fighting lines is a point on which we have disagreed. It is not the way of serving my country that I would have chosen, but still, it is a way.
When he was in Richmond, it was very cold. He was in solitary confinement, but it just so happened that there was a little gap under the wall, and he was able to send notes to Bert Brocklesby, and the two of them, one taught the other how to play chess, and they actually played chess through the wall. At one point, he was in prison with a jailbird who thought that his treatment was very severe, but he taught him Morse code, and so he was able to communicate with others in Morse code. They were very hungry all the time, and one day the prison officer was passing his door, and he put his hand out and snatched a potato off a plate, and very soon after that he was asked to go to the governor's office, and he still had this potato in his pocket, and he thought he was being reprimanded for taking the potato. So he dropped his potato in the yard as he was going to the office, When he got there, he was told that he was going to be allowed to send mail home because he'd been good behaviour. And so he had to walk back and see his potato sitting there on the ground. They were taken from Richmond prison, all the 16 of them, by train to France. As they were going through York, one of them managed to throw a note out of the train, and Arnold Rowntree picked it up and took it to the House of Parliament, as far as I can gather from the story. Amazing. Because they knew that they were going to be sentenced to death in France when they refused to put army uniform on. And so Asquith said that these men mustn't be made into martyrs, and told Earl Haig that he had to commute it to penal servitude. They were told that they were going to be sent to France and put into uniform. They'd already decided between them, most of them, that they wouldn't. As far as I know, they didn't tell them what would happen when they got there. When they actually got to France, they were court-martialed, and each one individually had to stand in front of Earl Haig, and he sentenced them, told them what their sentence would be. They also were told that the person who'd been before them had said that they would fight, and they told them that they would be sentenced to death. They would have a day to think about it, and they all went off for their day and played football on the beach. And then they were put before the court-martial and told that they were going to be sentenced to death. There was a long pause, then the sentence was commuted to penal servitude, and only one of their number said that he would go onto the front line and put uniform on, and he found that he was having to serve breakfast to these others who hadn't given in, and he broke down, and eventually he actually committed suicide.
Andrew Fawkes, 30th of November, 1914, Barracks. My dear father, about the immediate future. As has been said, the Society of Friends has come to the parting of the ways. Either they must stand aside, or else do every man what they can. The Friends have stood for peace for centuries, but now it is a question of extirpating the greatest enemy to all peace that the world has ever seen. I suppose you can see what I am leading up to. I want your leave to apply for a commission in another part of the army. I quite admit the great inability of the mending side of the business and would rather do it, but it is everybody's duty now to do what is most useful. And to my mind, there can be no two opinions as to whether a person of my education is more useful not in the ranks, but as an officer. As you know, my convictions on the subject of war are not quite as strong as yours. While agreeing with you that war is a terrible thing, I think that under certain circumstances, it is a man's duty to take up arms in a just cause. These circumstances have now arisen. The Germans have shattered our ideals of world peace for the present. And at present, we are fighting for peace. Where does the Quaker idea fit in here? Surely it fits in like this. As I believe many friends have said, this is a question for every man's individual conscience. Well, since my conscience lets me go, don't you think it is my duty to go? All this, of course, apart from my very strong desire to do more than at present. I believe I could make a good officer. As you say in your letter today, I am of age now. I can think for myself about these things. At the same time, of course, your help and comment is essential. The question almost narrows itself to this. It's my conscience against your conscience in respect to my future. Do you know the lines? And gentlemen of England, now abed, will think their manhood shamed they were not here. Would you have me ashamed all my life that I did not take a more active part in this war than there is any chance of doing here?
When they came home from France, they came home on the same ship as some of the soldiers who'd been injured, and the crowd saw these conscientious objectors and shouted and jeered at them and said, "Look at these cowards. They're all going home. They're not going to fight." And the crowd got very angry and pushed them until they almost pushed them into the harbour, and there was a little boy standing next to one of them, and one of the conscientious objectors, and I think it was probably Norman because he was learning French at the adult school, said to him, "We're only following our master." And the person next to the little boy said, "What did he say?" And he passed the message on, and gradually the crowd drew back. After he'd had this experience, after he'd been to break stone up in Aberdeen in the quarries over winter time, living in a tent, he became quite ill with asthma, and that did affect him for the rest of his life. When he went back looking for a job, of course, he found it very hard to get anything because nobody wanted to give him a job. He'd played for East Bolton Cricket Club, the first team. They wouldn't have him in the cricket club. And so life was tough. He became a clerk selling insurance, and then Martin Pumphrey, who was a Quaker from Pumphrey Sugar Mills, employed him and took him on as in the office, and he stayed there for the rest of his life and married his daughter. When he first came out of prison, he met his future first wife, Eva. Now, Eva had been looking after Austrian refugees, and so they delayed their marriage, and their first child was born in 1925. But sadly, because she was much older when she had the baby, she died. And so Norman was left with this baby and no wife, very sadly. His sister, who was so supportive, came and looked after the baby, and she also had another sister. He spent 6 months with one and 6 months with the other. My husband, Martin Gordy, was asked to go into the army, and of course he had a tribunal and was quite definite that he was going to be a conscientious objector. He was at the time just going into university, and so he had his tribunal, and in fact they gave him land work, and it completely changed his whole career because he was going to do economics at Cambridge and he changed to agriculture, and that of course affected the rest of his life. And he had a farm, still has a farm in North Yorkshire. He met me on the farm the day he was looking round the farm because my father was there talking about the machinery. That was in 1964. And I went along, met Martin, and a few months later we got married.
Theodore Fox, First World War Memoir. When I left Leighton Park School in December 1917, I intended, if I could, to join the Inns of Court Officer Training Corps, but after much discussion with my father and my uncle, I agreed to serve in the Friends Ambulance Unit for a time, pending a government decision on whether to recall medical students from the forces. My father thought that both Friends and doctors were committed to healing, not destruction. No doubt, though he did not say so, he hoped he would not have to lose his third and only surviving son. I, on the other hand, wanted to serve in the same way as others of my age. Rightfully enough, I believed that a better world would be possible if the Germans were defeated, but not if they won. At the same time, like so many others, I inwardly dread army service and what would be expected of me. So, if the government said they would rather have me as a medical student, I should have thankfully accepted the verdict. Members of the Society of Friends could get a protection certificate entitling them to join their society's unit, and such a certificate was issued for me. I did not like it at this time, but at least I had one respectable reason for agreeing to join the Friends Ambulance Unit, that it would enable me to go to France very soon. For more than 3 years, the war had been the background of our lives, and from a very young age, I still saw it chiefly as offering adventure. After spending my boyhood on the edge of war, it was a new adventure to hear the continuous rattle of the bombardment, to see the trickling matter-of-fact lines of wounded. Then came the long night watch, when one sat on the pantry table, fortified with coffee, but dropping with fatigue. The compartments full of sleeping men, some groaning,
the sense of work reasonably well done, and the complete uncertainty of tomorrow. All this went into the head of someone newly from the classroom.
I'm Kendall Clark, Leicester Quaker Meeting. I'm talking about my father, Roderick Clark, who was born in 1884. He was living with his parents in Purley and working in the City of London. Right from the beginning, he was aware of the risk of war, and he was one of the fairly large number of younger friends who had been influenced by the transformation of the society that started with John Wilhelm Rowntree and moving away from the quietist and from the evangelical standards, but still very much a Christian Quaker witness. He died when I was 7, so I didn't really question him in any way as a child, but he did fortunately leave a lot of records of his time at this period. And I know he had been an active young friend going to Quaker conferences and settlements at the turn of the century before Woodbrook. In fact, he attended the opening of Woodbrook, having cycled down from where he'd been working as a trainee in business in Thirsk with a Quaker firm there. He was 32 by then. He had been convinced really by the gospel message that you should love your enemies, and had been one of those who had written from the Friends Llandudno Conference a letter to all those young people who might be considering whether it was right to fight. And I've got a copy of that statement there, of which he was one of the people who drafted it. It was signed by Henry Hodgkin. And so he'd been working against the war in all sorts of ways. He'd been a founder member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was the Quaker representative from Meeting for Sufferings, or from Friends Peace Committee, to the FOR and the No Conscription Foundation Federation, I think it was, which sought to bring together people from all the different churches who were opposed to the war. So he was campaigning fairly actively in all his spare time, and he had a fair bit because his business didn't take him all his time, or he was prepared to give up the working day and work late at night and sleep on his office desk or under it, if need be. He saw it as the responsibility of each individual to follow their conscience.
Yearly Meeting Clark. Minute of London Yearly Meeting, January 1916. We feel strongly that all our members should be engaged in true national service. As to what form the service shall take, this is a matter for the conscience of each individual, and we cannot, as a society, attempt to decide it. That can only be done, each for himself, by thought and prayer for that divine wisdom which is given liberally to all who seek it aright. Our testimony in this connection as a society is against all war, and on behalf of the supremacy and liberty of conscience. This we unhesitatingly reaffirm, and where our members are brought into difficulty or suffering through obedience to conscience, we take our stand beside them, and assure them of our loving sympathy and support.
My father was an officer of, I think he's the leader, of a Free Church boys' camp in Wensleydale at the time when war was declared, and one of the junior officers was the brother of T. Lawrence of Arabia, who was in the OTC at Oxford. He was recalled and presumably went out to France and was actually killed before Christmas 1914. My father had a lot of friends who followed their conscience into the services, and of course about a third of all the young Quakers who were eligible for military service joined up before conscription came in. It was their choice, in the same way as it was the choice of some to work with the FAU, the Friends Ambulance Unit. I found some correspondence which suggested he was a little critical of the way of life. Perhaps it was a little unwinding after the stress of working in very difficult conditions, which are of course described in Corder Catchpool's book. But he in fact had some links with the FAU. I think he may have been somewhat involved in some of their training work, because later on he did training work for the Friends Relief Service, and he was on the recruitment subcommittee for men who were going out to work for relief in France or Belgium or Holland, or Belgian refugees in particular, and also in those parts of France which had been invaded by the Germans and then had been recovered by the French army. And he spent quite a bit of time selecting and then giving some sort of training to those who went out for that service. In the first instance, the tribunal gave him absolute exemption, along with two other people who were before the tribunal at the same time. And I have the details of correspondence which he told him he got absolute exemption, and then later calling him back for re-examination when the tribunal decided they want to think again about the exemption they're given to him. Then he was told he could have exemption from non-combatant service if he could find work that satisfied the authorities that it was in the national interest. He offered all the voluntary work he was doing, but it wasn't considered in the national interest, and in due course he was arrested and court-martialed after being handed over by the police to the army, court-martialed before disobeying an order, and sentenced initially to 6 months imprisonment. Very intriguing, my father said, "I have a right to see why the tribunal is calling me again." They sent him the letter from the military representative saying, "I believe the tribunal hasn't the right to impose an absolute exemption." And my father looked up the law and wrote back saying, "Yes, paragraph such and such says that the tribunal can grant absolute exemption." So when he went to the tribunal, the chairman carefully said, "It's our decision, not as a result of the letter that you were told was the reason for you being recalled." And my father then said, "Fair enough, it's your decision to recall me." And the procedure went on, and we then got to the stage that we were just in. I think he had some time in Wormwood Scrubs, which was said at one time to have the largest Quaker meeting in Britain. I don't know whether that's true. It sounds a good story. Most of the time he spent in Maidstone. I know he was allowed to write business letters connected with his business, in addition to letters that he could, I think, was strictly limited to what he could write home. One letter I found was asking for his account to be debited to send books to a whole lot of friends up and down the country. I think they're all concerned with the pacifist position, but apparently that was done by his parents. There's one lovely story. There were other conscientious objectors in the prison. Don't know whether they were all in their own cells. Robert Mennell one day said, "Hi, friends, the governor's going to send us all home for Christmas." And apparently he was. Robert Mennell was taken out and sent home for Christmas. But I don't know. I think it was some compassionate cause. But I don't think my father got that particular way out. You got out, and then you had a day or so before everybody, the bureaucratic system, caught up with you. You were then rearrested, handed over to the military authorities, and went through the same rigmarole again, and that happened 5 times for my father. And a total sentence, he spent a total of just over 2.5 years in prison, coming out in April 1919. I don't think it affected his attitude particularly. He seemed to be fairly active from what I remember as a child, and he certainly hadn't, like Norman Gordy, suffered anything like the severe health problems, so far as I'm aware. But he did die in his mid-50s. My mother felt that possibly the time in prison had affected his health. I think the strain and stress she thought might have been related to the cancer that he eventually died from.
Harold Wild, Diary, 12th of January 1916. Our German class met tonight after a month's Christmas interruption. I come to the conclusion now that, instead of doing as I had started, revising all my matric subjects with the hope of restarting definite study again at the end of March, I must face conscription. The government bill is apparently going to swim through the House, and I must be true to my conscience. I am determined to be imprisoned or shot before I will take up munition work or minesweeping or any work distinctly military under the military authorities.
I've got a rather dear little letter written to my grandmother and grandfather from Kingston Barracks by a Sergeant Templar, and it is a beautiful testimonial written in copperplate writing to the characters of my father and Robert Mennell, who he had in his custody for a short time before or during their court-martial. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Clark, I hope you will forgive me for not writing to thank you for the copies of your son's trial. I was having a chat with Mr. Brennan, author of A Short Way to a Long Peace, and I gave him one of the copies. I thank you very much for the beautiful fountain pen, which is always to be seen on the table, and my corporal likes it very much. We were all so very sorry to see so many grand men wasting valuable time in prison. I can just picture Roderick Clark and Robert Mennell doing the washing and mending sacks, but let's hope this horrible war will end all wars. And of course, we know that the people who would advocate armaments and strife and exploitation for their own business reasons, but although they are against war, we think we are doing our duty to fight against Germany. And though we are sorry to see conscription introduced in this country, let us hope that that is not to keep afterwards. I hope your son's health will keep good whilst he is in the scrubs. All my men wish to be remembered as he was quite like one of us. Please, dear Mrs. Clark, thank you very much for your kind thoughts to us all. Yours sincerely, W. Templar.
Harold Wild, Diary, 11th of May 1916. After waiting 1.5 hours, I was heard at Judge Mellor's court of the Appeal Tribunal in the town hall. When my opportunity to speak came along, I said I desired to read a letter which I sent to the recruiting office on receiving notice to report. I had read only 2 or 3 lines when Judge Mellor tried to stop me, saying, "Oh yes, we all agree with that. We don't believe in war. We are as anxious as you are, etc." I insisted on going on and got 2 or 3 words more, but Mellor again broke in. He said they had not time to spend listening to what applicants might have to say. I protested that, as this was of supreme importance to me, a matter perhaps for life or even death, I ought to be granted my rights. They asked me what I should be willing to do in being exempted from fighting. I said I should persuade everybody I could that a peace by negotiation was immediately desirable. The last 2 or 3 words I could not utter, through the chairman interrupting rather impatiently. I was asked what I was prepared to do for my country, and I said I should distribute peace literature, as I had already been doing. I was saying that, in offering me non-combatant duties, the tribunal were recognizing my conscience and accepting my word in one respect. Yet, though I told them definitely I could not accept it, they took no notice of my sincere word in regard to non-combatant work, when again the chairman prevented me from finishing my sentence. In leaving my chair, I protested to the chairman that non-combatant work was of no use to me. They might as well order me to combatant service. He replied something about the cocksureness of boys of 20.
Towards the end of my school career, my 18th birthday came up, and conscription was still in force in Britain, although it was after the end of the Second World War. I remember writing a statement for the tribunal that would be held in Bristol during the Easter holidays and sending it off. And later on, during the summer term, I had my exams, history and geography, Latin and French, and I was appointed by Somerset Quaker meeting to go and attend yearly meeting, which in 1948 was held in Edinburgh. So when the term ended at school, my brother and I got on our bicycles and cycled up towards Glasgow initially, up the Wharfe Valley, then over Shap, up to Glasgow, and because there was time in hand, we went up as far as Rannoch Station, had to take the train there because there was no road, and cycled back down to Edinburgh, where I was at yearly meeting. During that time, my mother had a letter saying, "Come to your tribunal." That was addressed to me. She wrote back and said, "I don't know where he is. He's cycling to go to yearly meeting." And of course, in those days, there were no mobile phones. So, in their wisdom, the Bristol Tribunal heard my case and said, as I'd indicated, I was willing to work on a farm as there wasn't any war going on at that time for Britain. I was given alternative service on the land or in forestry, and I eventually ended up working on a farm in the Quantocks for 2 years, and that changed my life. I decided to make agriculture my career, and eventually joined the Colonial Agricultural Service and went overseas and worked in Malawi.
Harold Wild, Diary, 24th of January 1917. Today is my 21st birthday. The main thing of moment to me is that I can now act politically without the fear of bringing penalties for my acts on my parents as a minor. I shall be responsible. I shall suffer any punishments myself, which contravention or defiance of any iniquitous measures on the statute book may involve.